Evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. An Indigenous woman who was involved in a serious hit and run in Winnipeg is speaking out this week. The family, who is from Buffalo Point First Nation in southern Manitoba, hopes that by telling their loved one's story, it will lead to justice and finding those responsible. APTN's Krisa Nachkate has more.
She's right here, and she said that it pulled up, then she went by the passenger side, and she was walking, then it bumped her.
Margaret Kobenis explains where her daughter was involved in a serious hit and run that happened over the weekend near downtown Winnipeg.
She said she was laying on the ground, she was fighting to get up, and that's when she made eye contact with the person.
On Saturday, March 15th at around 12:30 a.m., Margaret Kobenis' daughter, Margaret Kobenis Jr., was walking north on Osborne Street and crossing Mulvey Avenue. Kobenis says a white van pulled up near the corner as she was crossing Mulvey. She thought it was safe to keep crossing, but the driver drove forward. He hit her and then ran her over, breaking multiple bones. The driver then sped off and traveled north on Osborne.
I hope my daughter's alive. That's what's running through my head. I hope she's alive.
When I got to the passenger side, just before that, we looked at each other and I didn't even make it to the other end. He just pressed on the gas and I hit the ground. I tried getting up and he continued to run over me.
A passerby called 911 as Kobenis crawled to the sidewalk and she was rushed to the Health Sciences Center. The following day, her family held an awareness gathering outside of the hospital. The hit and run left Kobenis with multiple bone fractures, including injuries to her shoulder, collarbone, ribs, and pelvis.
It gets worse every day. My mental health has got worse. I can't sleep at night. I keep getting flashbacks of that moment. I can't eat sometimes.
Winnipeg police are now looking for a large white cargo-style van, and they are asking the driver to turn himself in. The family believes the hit and run was intentional.
To this person or persons that are involved that did this to my child, I wish they would come forward because they're responsible for my daughter. She's suffering. She's very scared.
The Winnipeg Police Service is asking anyone with information about this hit and run to come forward and to contact police or Crime Stoppers. They're also asking if anyone has any video that includes CCTV footage and dash cam video to come forward. Krisa Nachkate, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Thanks, Krisa. Tragedy has struck again in Carry the Kettle, Nakota Nation in Saskatchewan. Just last month, the nation was the scene of a quadruple homicide. Now police are investigating another suspicious death there. File Hills First Nation Police Service in southern Saskatchewan says it received a report just before 3 a.m. Friday, March 21st, of a sudden death on the nation. A news release from Saskatchewan RCMP says further investigation has determined that the death was suspicious in nature. Saskatchewan RCMP Major Crimes is now investigating the death of an adult male. No one has been arrested or charged at this point in the investigation. RCMP say residents of Carry the Kettle, Nakota Nation may notice an increased police presence as this investigation continues. With the federal election call still a few days away, the NDP is already taking aim at the Liberals and new Prime Minister Mark Carney, digging up a dismissed court application made by a First Nation in Northern Ontario against the company Carney once served as vice chairman of. APTN's Fraser Needham has more.
In a Friday virtual press conference, the NDP dug up an old court application made by the Mississauga First Nation against Brookfield Renewable Energy over the impacts of 4 hydroelectric dams on the Mississauga River, about 134 kilometers southeast of Sault Ste. Marie.
While Carney was pretending to work on making the world a more sustainable place as vice chair of environmental social governance at Brookfield, the reality was very different. Under Carney's environmental leadership, Brookfield trampled on First Nations rights and fought them in court every step of the way.
Laura Mayer is councillor with the Mississauga First Nation. She's also the NDP candidate for Sault Ste. Marie Algoma. Mayer criticized the Liberals for shrinking the size of cabinet and vowing to move faster on pipeline projects.
It's the growing trend of downgrading Indigenous issues, folding ministries, cutting funding, or promising to fast-track development without free, prior, and informed consent. We've seen governments say they're focused on what matters most to Canadians, while completely ignoring how that work's done by creating effective and responsive partnerships with Indigenous communities.
Ontario Superior Court documents show Mississauga First Nation brought a court application against Brookfield Renewable Energy and the Ontario government in June 2022, alleging they had violated the First Nations Section 35 rights regarding permits to take water at the hydroelectric dams. A judge dismissed the application, but this did not stop NDP MP Nikki Ashton from continuing to hammer away at Carney's environmental record well with Brookfield Asset Management.
This is a company funding initiatives impacting the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples and the environment. Turns out Carney's definition of investing in green energy includes violating Indigenous water rights and steamrolling First Nations.
APTN News reached out to the Prime Minister's office for comment, but did not hear back by press time. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
The province of Saskatchewan has released its official 2025-26 budget, and $284.9 million will go towards a variety of Indigenous-led initiatives. A $29.7 million increase in funding will provide programs and services in First Nations and Métis communities across the province. $107.4 million will be allocated to the First Nations Trust, Métis Development Fund, and other social and economic opportunities. Nearly $24 million will go to on-reserve policing and $5.5 million to improving education outcomes. $4 million will go to reintegration programs for offenders and $1 million to the First Nations and Métis Consultation Fund for government relations. The remaining $113.3 million is divided into social services, health, highways, justice, parks and culture, and trade and export development. A Vermont politician has introduced a bill to change the way Native American groups are recognized. That story and more coming up. Welcome back. A Vermont politician from that state's House of Representatives has introduced a bill that proposes to make changes to how the state recognizes groups claiming to be Native American tribes. It's a win for the Abenaki in Quebec, who say the tribes in Vermont are not First Nations. But the tribes in Vermont say due process was already done years ago. Angel Moore reports.
Rather, you were misled. Individuals and groups without legitimacy have manipulated history.
Members of the Abenaki Council of Odanak and Wolanak from Quebec spoke at the Vermont State House during a public workshop called What If We Got It Wrong? Abenaki leaders and experts presented evidence that tribes previously recognized by Vermont are not Abenaki. Jacques Watso is a councillor of Abenaki Council of Odanak in Quebec.
We call them the Fraudinakis of Vermont, the four fake tribes that claim Abenaki ancestry, our Indigenous ancestry.
You're in our territory.
No, you are in our territory.
It got heated at times. The Vermont Abenaki people voiced their opposition. Don Stevens is the chief of the Nulhegan Band of the Kawasak Abenaki in Vermont. He insists the Vermont tribes are legitimate.
We are Indigenous, and we have been living here and for millennia, and we have our lived experience.
The workshop was organized by State Representative Troy Hedrick, who felt Vermont's recognition process was flawed.
I'm grounded in the evidence that I find incredibly compelling that we did get it wrong. And this despite any sort of federal standards that clearly identified the Vermont recognized tribes as not Indigenous.
4 Vermont Abenaki tribes received state recognition in 2011 and 2012. Watso says they were misled.
And it caused all the harm that it does now. And it's not just a state problem in Vermont. It's a North American, not even a global issue on cultural appropriation of Indigenous voices.
Abenaki traditional lands stretch from Vermont and north into Canada. Colonization and war in the 17th century forced the Abenaki to move north, where they established the Odanak and Wolanak in Quebec. But 4 groups in Vermont say they are Abenaki. Watso says the evidence proves otherwise, and the groups are causing harm.
Because they are rewriting our history, they have access to the burial remains of our ancestors. There are funneling public funds that are destined to Indigenous voices, and they are erasing us by replacing us.
The Odanak Abenaki took their opposition to the United Nations Permanent Forum last year, including renting a billboard in Times Square to denounce Indigenous identity fraud.
They take our culture, they speak in our place, they take our voice.
Since the workshop, Hendricks introduced a bill to the Vermont House of Representatives. It proposes to change the process of state recognition of Indigenous tribes and create a task force which will include the Abenaki of Odanak and Wolanak to review the validity of prior recognition of state tribes. Hendricks says including the Abenaki is significant since they were not included in the 2011 and 2012 discussions, which led to Vermont recognizing the 4 state tribes as Abenaki.
This is a mistake that our state legislature made well before I got there. I do feel it is my obligation now as an elected representative to correct that mistake and to repair the harm from that mistake.
But Stephen says this process already happened in 2010 and 2012.
Now, we did follow the United States process, which is to be recognized by a state or federal government, and we did that. And there was a complete process with scholars and also with the legislative body. So creating a bill to do the same thing doesn't make a lot of sense to me when we were recognized almost 15 years ago.
Watso says the bill is a good step forward, but there is more work to do.
It's a widespread phenomenon. It's a tsunami of wannabes claiming our ancestry and monetizing it. We see it. It's on everybody's lip, and now it's time to unite on a common front to say enough is enough.
Angel Moore, APTN National News, Jabuktuk, also known as Halifax.
Perimeter Aviation has renovated their airport terminal in Winnipeg, opening a 20,000 square foot expansion they hope will improve their service to northern communities. Our reporter Tyler Shingoose has more.
This is a great day, and I'm glad we're here together.
Some of the new additions include an improved security screening system, 2 gates to allow for more flights, as well as increased energy systems to ensure sustainability. Joey Prechisor speaks for Perimeter Aviation.
One of the things that we do to try and serve our communities too is make sure that we have passenger screening for passenger baggage, passengers, and freight. And we're looking for illicit drugs, making sure that those don't make it to communities.
Most of the people who use Perimeter Aviation are from northern Indigenous communities. Garrison Settee is Grand Chief of the Manitoba Kiiwetinoong Okinawanak, representing 26 First Nations.
I feel very appreciative that there's a lot of space for our people to be able to be comfortable, especially when they're traveling for medical reasons, that there's a lot of space here. And it also reflects the culture of our people.
Petrisor says Manitoba could also help take northern travel to new heights by investing more in northern airports.
This terminal is just one example of how we are working to strengthen northern infrastructure. But we must not stop here. Continued investment in northern aviation is essential to economic growth and viability of northern communities.
Tyler Shingoose, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
This weekend, APTN Investigates kicks off a new 3-part series on policing. We'll speak with the reporter of the first documentary after the break. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. And if you've ever asked yourself, what would an English bulldog look like when it's in a peak state of relaxation? Here's Louis in full chill mode. Thanks, Jason. You can send your photos to share@aptn.ca. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, 10 above in Fredericton, 6 in Halifax. -7 with snow in Kuujjuaq and Nain. 11 above in Montreal, -10 with snow in Val-d'Or. -7 for Sault Ste. Marie and North Bay, +6 in Ottawa. Sunny and -4 in Thunder Bay, sun's out and -6 in Sioux Lookout. -7 in Thompson, God's Lake and Norway House. 3 below with snow in Brandon and Winnipeg. -2 and flurries in Regina, -5 with snow in Saskatoon. +3 in Meadow Lake, 0 in Buffalo Narrows. In northern Alberta, +1 with snow in High Level and Fort Chipewyan. 7 above in Edmonton and Medicine Hat, 9 in Lethbridge. 9 in Vancouver, 11 in Kamloops. Cloudy and 6 in Prince George, 5 in Smithers. -11 in Old Crow, 3 above in Whitehorse. Cloudy and -9 in Yellowknife and Norman Wells. -20 in Sax Harbor, 16 below with snow in Paulatuck. -24 in Chesterfield and Whale Cove. 24 below in Resolute, 19 below in Iqaluit. The issue of pretendianism has been described as harmful within Indigenous communities, and the discussion regained national attention in 2023 when it was revealed that musician Buffy St. Marie's claims of Cree heritage were questionable. As Savannah Craig reports, Montreal-based Ojibwe artist Wayne Robinson is taking a humorous approach to discussing Indigenous identity.
Bum-ba-da-dum. Your boy's DNA test just came in.
This Ojibwe artist is making light of his DNA results through what he calls a racial reveal party.
I did a live reaction to me getting the results.
It's more than just an unveiling of his ancestry, but a chance to have conversations that may be uncomfortable for some.
Can I be a pretend settler, right, and get rid of all that kind of trauma?
For Wayne Robinson, this is a way to discuss Indigenous identity, trauma, and pretendianism.
I'm 3% Irish. Does that not make me more Irish than the Irish, right?
He says discussing pretendianism is not always easy to engage with non-Indigenous people, citing the example of musician Buffy St. Marie, whose decades-long claim of Cree heritage came under question recently.
Talking about the harms that have been done by pretendianism are something we all grapple with, we all can really understand. But I think from outside of the community, it seems almost negative, right? It seems like we're attacking a little old lady who ascribed to do the best thing for Indigenous folks, and I think there are real harms there.
He says making a joke out of it is easier for everyone to engage in these important discussions.
Even with myself, right? Like I've always had a troubling relationship with my own identity. You know, I grew up in the inner city. I grew up really poor. I grew up not surrounded by a lot of other Indigenous people that weren't part of my immediate family. So my Indigenous identity for a lot of my life has not been as positive as I'd like it to be. And a lot of times it was always deflected by humor.
Robinson has been trying to have these conversations for a while, even with the Montreal Police Force, through hosting workshops on generational trauma and myths of Indigenous people.
Let's try to humanize ourselves and the community as much as possible.
Robinson recently launched a podcast called Unceded Identity.
The racial constructs and challenges were kind of dwarfed by the economic challenges. Right?
That will soon be released on all podcast streaming platforms.
Where the idea of the unseen is like, no, we have control of that. We have control of what our identities are. We have control of those stereotypes, those myths, and take your own story, but tell it in a different way to either ascribe to more positive aspects or move away from the negative ones.
So what was his biggest surprise from his DNA results?
To find out I was 25% British was kind of a surprise. You know, I don't know what I was expecting, but I think of the colonizer nations, British was not one of them.
Savannah Craig, APTN National News, Montreal.
In the final months of 2024, 15 Indigenous people died in police custody or during interactions with police across the country. The wave of violence caused an outcry among Indigenous communities and renewed calls for a national inquiry into systemic racism in policing. In the first of a special three-part series, APTN investigates the strained relationship between Indigenous peoples and law enforcement agencies in Canada. With more on the story, we are joined now by APTN Investigates video journalist Tamara Pimentel. Tamara, thanks for being with us. This is the first episode of a three-part series on policing. What can viewers expect?
So this first episode is sort of a recap of what happened last year. 15 Indigenous people died in police-related incidents. We hear from two families. The first is Edith Wells, a member of the Blood Tribe in southern Alberta. She's the mother of John Wells, who died following an altercation with Calgary police. We also hear from Natalie Lightning, the Cookum of Haas Lightning's Saddleback. He was the 15-year-old that was shot and killed by RCMP in Wetaskiwin when he called them for help. Both of those families were very active in the media, but we take a closer look at those stories and how they've impacted the communities. Edith Wells joined the AFN in Ottawa, calling the federal government for a national inquiry into racism within police forces in Canada. So we hear a bit about her experience there as well.
Besides the calls for an inquiry, what else are we hearing from families?
So in both of their interviews, Natalie and Edith questioned the cultural training that police are receiving across the country. And training was actually a topic that was brought up in every interview that we did for this story. We spoke with a former Indigenous cop, Blood Tribe Police Services, and they all say that there needs to be more than cultural training. Learning about Indigenous people needs to be sincere and not just a policy that police are forced to follow.
What's next for the families?
So all the families can really do at this point is wait. The investigations into the deaths are still ongoing. Autopsy reports haven't been finalized, and the calls for a national inquiry haven't been responded to yet. So all the families can do at this point is keep those stories going so they aren't forgotten about.
Tamara, really looking forward to this one and the whole series. Thanks for taking some time for us.
Thank you.
And you can catch APTN Investigates Inside Policing Deadly Force tomorrow night on APTN, right after APTN National News Weekend. And it is a busy night here tomorrow. Right after... Right after Investigates, it's Hockey Night in Canada in Inuktitut, featuring our hosts, Pujut, David, and Robert. Our featured game has the Ottawa Senators on the road to play the New Jersey Devils. Puck drops at 7 p.m. Eastern Time right here on APTN. And we're all out of time for your APTN National News for this Friday, but don't change the channel. Kim Sullivan is up next with your French language news. I'm Dennis Ward, Marcy Miigwech. Thanks for being with us. Have a great night.